Welcome to our lecture today on miracles. Today is the 1st of April 2015. Happy April Fool's Day. I am your humble instructor, and we're going to talk about miracles. All right, we want to first talk about a few different things, the importance of this issue. We want to talk about different definitions of miracle. We'll touch on Spinoza's view, and we're going to focus mainly on David Hume. Those of you in philosophy of religion, you've read section 10 of the inquiry titled On Miracles and part 1 and part 2. So we're going to go over some of the elements of that. We'll look at C.S. Lewis's, I forget what we have here of Lewis, and look at William Rowe. You've also read his chapter in his book Philosophy of Religion on miracles, and we'll look at some responses to these guys from Swinburne, Guyvett, and William Lane Craig. C.D. Broad is an atheist featured heavily in Rowe's book. We'll look at some of his stuff on indirect evidence. And I will encourage you to check these things out for yourself in the remaining years of your life. Because, yeah, very interesting. All right. Most of you weren't alive in 1980, but one of the most important events in American sports history is when the United States beat the Soviet Union. And here, if you want to Google Herb Brooks' speech, it's Kurt Russell in this movie, but it's pretty good. The Pulp Fiction, if you've seen this Quentin Tarantino film, is very interesting. This scene here where a guy comes out of the bathroom and unloads his clip and totally misses John Travolta and Mace Windu when he shot at him. And the conversation between Travolta and your buddy here is very interesting. All right. Prolegomena, what to know for exams, the importance of this issue, and skepticism that's been around forever, but especially the version we see in the last couple centuries. All right. What I want you to know for our exams, have a working idea of the different definitions of miracle, know about primary causation and secondary causation, if God exists, or any agent acts through primary and secondary causations. Hume's even if argument against believing in miracles, and then Hume's four arguments against believing in miracles. William Rowe's critiques of Hume from the Philosophy of Religion text. C.D. Broad's critiques, which are actually in the Rowe book. And then Richard Swinburne's view. You might be in a course where Swinburne is required reading, or you might just get the material from this talk here. All right. The importance of this issue is that everything could hang on it. Those of you working on worldview papers, you're going to talk about what beliefs are most central to your worldview and what beliefs are in the periphery. Some beliefs are more central to our worldview in the sense that they have a big impact on how we live our week, how we live, and also other beliefs might follow or be related to this core belief. So, for some religions, especially Christianity, a lot of things hinge on whether or not Jesus was actually raised from the dead. And that's the big miracle we're going to look at in this session. So, humans want to know if Jesus was who he said he was, and if God confirmed who Jesus was and his mission and message by this miracle of bringing him back to life. All right, so as good philosophers, we want to know if this is coherent, if it's epistemically justified that we should believe in such a miracle, what kind of evidence is good evidence for or against a miracle claim, when should we trust human testimony, when should we rely on indirect evidence, and so on. So this is a great philosophical issue, and it's very important. So, in my view, the creator of the universe, if she exists, used a miracle to alert human beings to the life and person of one Jesus Christ in the first century Palestine. In first century Palestine. This one miracle, if it is true, is the divine stamp on the life of Jesus and his message. So this miracle confirms Jesus' answers to the deepest questions in life. The big existential questions we have. Jesus gives the answers for which all humans have been searching for thousands of years. That God is a loving, personal God full of grace and truth, who loved us enough to send his Son to show us how to live and to die so that we could have eternal life now. If if you are from another country and unfamiliar, two guys who explain Christianity the best are Dallas Willard and Ravi Zacharias. Ravi Zacharias is from India, and Willard, he died a couple years ago, but he's fantastic. And look at their lectures, and they'll explain Jesus' mission best. All right, so if Jesus was who he said he was, it came down to answer these questions. We have God who showed up in the flesh, and he has given us hope and freedom and purpose and meaning in life, and he's answered death. So we as individuals and philosophers, we want to know if this is true. If it's a joke, if Jesus was a lunatic or he was a liar, then we can move on and check other religions, but we want to know if God showed up and walked the earth. And there you have it. All right. Rudolf Bultmann, my old professor called him Buttman. But he said this, and this reflects a certain sentiment why we shouldn't trust or believe in any miracles. Quote, "It is impossible to use the electric light and the wireless and to avail ourselves of modern medical and surgical discoveries and at the same time to believe in the New Testament world of spirits and miracles." Quote, "It may of course be argued that there are people alive today whose confidence in the traditional scientific view of the world has been shaken, and others who are primitive enough to qualify for an age of mythical thought. And there are also many varieties of superstition. What matters is the worldview which men imbibe from their environment, and it is science which determines that view of the world through the school, through the press, the wireless, the cinema, and the other fruits of technical progress." So, what we have here is a common assumption that the success of science in the last few hundred years undeniably has been phenomenal. Is this evidence for the worldview of scientific atheism or philosophical naturalism? And if the evidence for philosophical naturalism trumps that of any other worldview, then we should naturally ignore any fantastic or superstitious worldviews. Okay? So, discuss this. Another word for naturalism equals scientific atheism. You have philosophical naturalism. You also see scientific materialism, or just plain naturalism. Just if you're trying to figure out, ask somebody what they mean. Miracles since the Enlightenment. Since the rise of the mechanistic philosophy, this is the philosophy where everything is explained by pushes and pulls and atoms bouncing off of each other. And so we see this emerge in the last few hundred years. All right, with Robert Boyle and the like. Since the rise of the mechanical philosophy and philosophical naturalism, miracles have fallen out of favor, even with some Christian theologians. Now, Mormon theologians and philosophers believe God only works through natural laws. So there are no violations of natural law and miracles defined that way. So my friend is a neuroscientist. He, I think, says something to that effect. And so this is popular view where God only operates through secondary causation. He doesn't use, or she doesn't use, primary causation. Thomas Jefferson was a deist. His Bible has all of Jesus' miraculous doings cut out of it. So it's a deistic Bible. So Google that sometime. I think they just found it a few years ago. Now it's in the Smithsonian. The Anglican Bishop of Birmingham a few years ago said this, quote, "Miracles as they are narrated in the scriptures cannot in the light of our modern knowledge of the uniformity of nature be accepted as historical." All right. So even Christians think some Christians think that miracles are perhaps preposterous and maybe a nice fancy story to tell. Now, personally, I'll disagree, and if Jesus wasn't raised from the dead, I'm not an instrumentalist with regard to religion. I don't think we should go to church just for some kind of a spiritual opium, but you may disagree. Now, so is it reasonable to dismiss miracles a priori or before experience? First, we need to ask if miracles can happen, and second, we have to ask the epistemic question, if we could discover if one happened. And this is what Hume dealt with. So the first question is a metaphysical question. Can miracles happen? The second question is an epistemological question. All right, so it'll help you if you keep the resurrection of Jesus as a good test case throughout this presentation. This Easter is this Sunday in the United States of America. And here we have Charlton Heston. What is a miracle? So there's a problem of defining a word miracle. We'll have a working definition in this class, but we want to talk about some other different things. Maybe God works in other ways, namely primary and secondary causation. And so yeah, if God gives us thoughts, depending on your view of mind, it could be an action via primary causation or secondary causation. All right, Jessica Alba falling from heaven. So imagine that I've been praying for Jessica Alba to fall in love with me for years. Okay, I pray to Zeus, and guess what happens? Jessica Alba is skydiving, and she gets caught by the wind and ends up landing in a huge tree behind my house. And over the next few days, I nurse her wounds, and she falls in love with me. Now, is that a miracle that the good Lord brought the goddess to my doorstep? All right. So, you tell me what you think on the discussion board. George Schlesinger said this: "The major function of a miracle is to serve as a spectacular manifestation of God's direct intervention in promoting a divine plan, and thus inspire religious sentiments." Okay? So, Hume says there's a popular meaning. A miracle is an unexpected beneficial event. But there's a strict meaning. Two components. First, an event that would not have occurred had what transpired been due only to natural causes. And secondly, an event that is the result of the direct intervention of God or some supernatural agent. All right, now Rowe has some problems with Hume's definitions. You can read these, but he says they're neither necessary nor sufficient. He says we can add a couple features, that namely a miracle is a surprising, astounding event, and fourth, that a miracle serves some important beneficial purpose. So some examples from the Bible are John 11, where Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, Matthew 9, 27 to 31, the healing of the two blind men, and in Mark 6, you have the feeding of the 5,000. So these are obvious events. If they happen, they were meant to show has some purpose. All right. Pause it here, and you can read this slide, but basically this is rehashing of what Rowe talks about or not. Let me read the quote from Hume. He says, quote, "A miracle may either be discoverable by men or not. This alters not its nature or essence. The raising of a house or ship into the air is a visible miracle. The raising of a feather, when the wind wants ever so little of a force requisite for that purpose, is as real as a miracle, though not so sensible with regard to us. So, what he's saying is God could be doing miracles all day long, and say there's no wind in the backyard, but the leaves are blowing around as if it's wind, and it's God causing it directly via supernatural causation, not through the natural flow of wind. All right. So that's why Rowe wants to distinguish between invisible miracles and visible miracles. All right. Also, William Rowe thinks Hume's definition is not necessary. He thinks we can make a distinction between a fortunate coincidence and a genuine miracle. All right. Primary versus secondary causation. Okay. Primary causation by God or some other agent is done directly by the agent. So, if Krisha is taking a sip of her Monster Energy drink, she grabs the can herself, lifts it to her lips, and drinks it. That's a primary act by that agent. Or, Krisha can drink via secondary causation. Krisha can order somebody else, hey, Larry, grab this Monster Energy drink and put it to my lips. And so Larry does it, but Krisha does it through a patient, Larry, or another agent. Does that make sense? So I can directly shoot Jones, or I can tell a soldier to shoot Jones, and he tells another soldier, and Jones gets shot via these means of these events. So, with regards to God's action in the world, maybe God does a special miracle where God actually, well, we'll give some examples here in a second. So some things may be miracles in the non-technical sense if an event is startling and if it is used by God for some divine objective. So those fit within the biblical tradition. So, if I was on my knees praying for a wife and Jessica Alba landed in the tree and fell in love with me, God may have used secondary causation. So maybe God orchestrated millions of years before Jessica Alba exists that this chain of events would happen. Because if God has foreknowledge, God knows what I'm going to pray millions of years before I pray it. And God can rearrange nature or even design the earth so that certain things will happen. Jessica Alba will do such and such, and she'll get on a plane, she'll skydive in Cincinnati, and she'll fall into Clifton and land in the tree in the backyard on Warner Street. All right. Does that make sense? Now, if God used a comet to part the Red Sea, how did God part the Red Sea? Now, people are going to disagree on how that is done, right? So, if you saw Exodus, Gods and Kings with what's the angry Batman guy? Christian Bale. How did God part the Red Sea in this movie? I haven't seen it, but what for my guess is it's from secondary causation. Primary causation is more like the Charlton Heston Exodus movie, the Ten Commandments, where the sides of the water in the Red Sea were miraculously held up. Okay? Secondary causation is if there's an earthquake or typhoon or tornadoes that part the Red Sea. Does that make sense? So God could have set up nature so that typhoons and tornadoes and earthquakes happened at the Red Sea right at that moment. And so so God's planning this out when Moses puts a staff down or raises his staff, the sea parts. But it wasn't by a direct miracle. God just set up the world so the sea would part at that moment. All right, I hope that makes sense. But we could talk about it. We'll give two more examples. Church choir in Beatrice, Nebraska, on the 1st of March, 1950. So all 15 members of a church choir were late for the 7:20 choir practice in March 1950 for very different reasons. One, a child was sick. Another tire blew on a guy's car. But all these different reasons, everybody was late. The church blew up at 7:25. So if the 15 choir members were on time, all of them would have been killed. Is it a miracle? If so, what would make it one? All right, we'd have to look at the individual reasons why each of the people were late. So maybe God acted by secondary causation in every moment. Maybe God miraculously put thoughts in the certain people's minds, like, oh, run and go to the store and get a loaf of bread before you go to church. And that made one guy 5 minutes late. All right. Or maybe God knew that a certain parent would stay home with a sick child. Um, or maybe God made sure this child had the flu, so she vomited at 7:15, and so this parent was late after she cleaned up the vomit. Whatever, but you get my point. And secondary causation becomes much more probable if God knows the future, and God can know what free-willed agents are going to pray thousands or million years of advance. Okay? And if God has middle knowledge, that means God knows whatever we're going to pray ever on this planet. And so God can set up the universe to answer a lot of prayers, and as my one buddy thinks, never have to miraculously intervene, except maybe in the case of Jesus' resurrection. All right. Oh, I love this film for this point here. Anybody see the movie Bedtime Stories? But if you've seen this, you see miraculous things happening. Adam Sandler makes up a story the night before, and things happen. Like saying it's going to rain gumballs. And what do you know? The next day, Adam Sandler's driving on a highway, and there's a traffic jam, and a truck that's above him on the overpass. All of a sudden, the back door is open, and all these gumballs fall on his car. So, all right. Dr. Helen Roseveare. She was an English missionary in Africa. She was a doctor. Take time out now. Google her story, The Hot Water Bottle. All right? And think about it. Why did this happen? And assume, for the sake of argument, that God was behind it. How did God get the people in that Bible study to do what they did? Okay? And do you think this would count as a miracle or just God's acting in the world? That maybe is not a miracle. All right, there are many different definitions of a miracle, but William Lane Craig will go with his view. Miracles are naturally impossible events. So, he thinks they should not be defined as violations of the laws of nature. So, we don't necessarily need to go on this philosophy of science tangent. But regularity theory of nature describes what happens with the laws of nature. Logical necessity theory allows predictions, but Craig thinks a better definition, which is similar to Hume's, is that miracles are naturally impossible events. Okay? So, here we go. Does quantum physics show miracles are possible? You want to pause it and read this slide. For more, you can go to more from William Lane Craig. But you'll hear about a lot of these theories on Coast to Coast AM and on cable television. But we want to move on here. The philosophers against miracles: Baruch Spinoza, David Hume. Spinoza had a very interesting worldview. But he says, here's his main argument. Premise 1. Miracles are violations of natural laws. Premise 2. Natural laws are immutable. Premise 3. It is impossible for immutable laws to be violated. Therefore, miracles are impossible. Alright? Yeah. You know what? I'm going to skip this. So, So yeah, just one anomaly in the course of nature. We don't want to say that there are. All right, I'm just going to skip all this. All right, this is more interesting. Spinoza's theological arguments against miracles. So, God, as a grand epistemologist, wants to make the world understandable to human beings, and if he or she violates those laws with her primary causal acts, it would lead to atheism. The universe would be like a haunted house, and humans would never be able to do science, and they would live in fear. People would become atheists. God is perfect. God would never have a need to violate natural law. He or she would use secondary causation and not primary causation. So I think this is very interesting. All right. But what do you think? How might a theist respond to Spinoza, even if you're an atheist? If God uses her supernatural power, in other words, not using secondary causation, to do a lot of miracles, would it lead to atheism? And is it against God's perfection to create a world where he or she periodically jumps in it and acts via primary causation? In other words, does miracles. All right. So to ask it, I think, is kind of to answer it. You know what? If God does miracles sparingly, we know, okay, this is nature. And you know what? People don't regularly get healed by prayer to the point where we throw out medicine and we just pray instead. No. Instead, we have oncologists who deal with cancer. We don't go to the prayerologist or the theologian and just pray for cancer. We might do that in addition to going to the oncologist, but we want to go and deal with it. We have doctors because science works. Medicine is a wonderful discipline, and so we don't just pray. We actually go to the doctor because 99.9% of the time, healings are not miraculous. Does that make sense? And the same thing, it makes sense to study chemistry and physics. Okay, the world is not a haunted house where miracles will be done every 10 minutes, so that we can't even make predictions and describe the laws of nature. All right, now on to David Hume, section 10 of miracles or on miracles, in an inquiry concerning human understanding. All right. He was a Scottish philosopher of the 18th century. I took a picture of this statue where he's in a toga in Edinburgh on the Royal Mile, and it was funny. Everybody I talked to thought that statue was horrible. That he should have been in his 18th century period dress instead of looking like Socrates. But you be the judge. Okay, section 10 of miracles. He gives two arguments: the even if argument and the but in fact argument. The four but in fact arguments. Okay, now this is key because this section deals with miracles founded on the testimony of others. Now, some atheists like C.D. Broad will talk about think Hume made a fundamental mistake, that oftentimes that some of the best evidence for a miracle is the indirect evidence. Okay? And so keep that in mind because Hume assumes that we just have the testimony of the yahoos, or the people we saw who claimed to see Jesus raised from the dead. All right? To illustrate this, say you and your spouse have 4 little girls aged 8 to 12. Okay? All of you are hiking in the woods, and 4 girls, well, you're camping. So your 4 girls run ahead and go to the campsite, and then they run back and they say, "Mommy, Daddy, a bear has gone through our campsite. We just saw him running away, blah, blah, blah." All right. Now, you might be skeptical of your 4 daughters. Maybe they're all wild tale tellers like my niece. Okay? So you'll hold that testimony like, maybe they're right, maybe they're not. But once you get to the campsite, with the indirect evidence, you'll be able to tell. So you'll see bear claws, bear footprints in the mud, and bear teeth marks on the watermelon on the picnic table. So the indirect evidence, oh, now we can trust the testimony of our four daughters because this indirect evidence of a bear being here confirms the testimony. All right? So Hume doesn't seem to address this, but so keep that in mind. All right, part one. Even if we grant, for the sake of argument, that a miracle occurred, it would still be irrational to believe it. So, in his view, even if we have the best testimonial evidence possible, it is still more reasonable to believe that the witnesses were in error. Okay? So, even if God raised Jesus from the dead, our experience over and over of people dying and staying dead, that should trump anything we hear from these yahoos who claim they saw Jesus killed and then raised from the dead. All right? So, it's another part in part 1 of section 10. Hume does maintain that there may be a critical mass of testimony whereby it becomes more reasonable to believe in the miraculous event than not. And as Rowe says, quote, only if the falsehood of the testimony would be more miraculous than the event to which it testifies is Hume prepared to believe that the event occurred rather than the witnesses were in error. And so far as the miracle stories in Christianity are concerned, it's clear that Hume's judgment is that the weight of the evidence is on the side of the witnesses being in error. Does that make sense? So if you have a case where let's say E.T. comes down in a spaceship, or let's say Magneto and E.T. show up in the White House, and E.T. brings a bunch of flowers, dead flowers, in the Oval Office back to life, and Magneto controls metal and flies around the White House. All right. So if you have the testimony of everybody in government, everybody in the CIA, everybody in the FBI, say 8,000 people witnessed Magneto and E.T. doing all this stuff, and all of us out here in middle America are like, wait a minute, really? And then after let's say you know all these people and they're credible people, and we can say, okay, it would be crazier to think that these 8,000 people, our president, vice president, people in FBI, CIA, NSA, are crazy and hallucinated than to think that Magneto and ET actually came here and did all this stuff. All right, I think you get the point. Rowe's summary of Hume's even if argument in part 1. Premise 1. Premise 1. The evidence from experience in support of a law of nature is extremely strong. Premise 2. A miracle is a violation of a law of nature. Conclusion. The evidence from experience against the occurrence of a miracle is extremely strong. To quote David Hume, a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, and as a firm and unalterable experience has established these laws, the proof against a miracle from the very nature of the fact is as entire as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined. Why is it more than probable that all men must die, that lead cannot of itself remain suspended in the air, that fire consumes wood and is extinguished by water, unless it be that these events are found agreeable to the laws of nature, and there is required a violation of these laws, or in other words, a miracle to prevent them. But it is a miracle that a dead man should come to life, because that has never been observed in any age or any country. There must therefore be a uniform experience against every miraculous event, otherwise the event would not merit that appellation. So we can't even call something a miracle unless we have experience to the contrary as the regular order of things. Right? So Hume is saying the evidence we take as establishing a certain principle as a law of nature stands against the evidence that something was a miracle. So your experience of lead falling to the ground will be evidence against your friend's claim, his testimony, that a 10-pound piece of lead floated out of his hand unaided by natural forces. Does that make sense? So the more we experience something like gravity, the less we're going to believe our friends when they say gravity was violated in this case. All right. So remember, this is an epistemic principle. He's like, how we know things, and when should we trust testimony? Okay. Now, it might be very different if we see it ourselves. All right. So if the lead floated out of our own hand, it'd be very different. Here's a variation of Hume's argument. David Hume said of his argument, quote, I flatter myself that I have discovered an argument which, if just, will, with the wise and learned, be an everlasting check to all kinds of superstitious delusion, and consequently will be useful as long as the world endures. End quote. Premise 1, a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. Premise 2, firm and unalterable experience has established these laws. Premise 3, a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. Famous quote. Conclusion, therefore, the proof against miracles is as entire as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined. But why is this the case? Is this true? Think of some cases. So, say our buddy Steve claims that he saw Kelsey, President Patrick Swayze. Oh, Swain. Swain was an old student. Steve claims that he called Kelsey, President Patrick Swayze, and his friend from Tajikistan flapping their arms and flying across the river. This is Craig's example from class back in 97. He said, look, there's practical benefit to what Hume says, so we should admit as much. It seems that we would want to avoid ad hoc hypotheses or contrived explanations to things like that. But is this extreme position justified? So the 17th century Christian apologists answered this and said that you do not need to have extraordinary evidence that a guy's dead and that now he's alive. Anybody off the street with even a kindergartner can tell when a guy's crucified and stabbed through the side and dead, not breathing for a few days, and then all of a sudden he's walking around like nothing happened, eating fish. Okay? So, it doesn't require extraordinary evidence. It just requires good evidence. All right. So, Craig here thinks we can take something from Hume that, hey, you know what? Yeah, we just don't want to believe anything off the street, and we don't want to just assume miracle, at the first glance. But no, if you're sitting there and 15 of you are watching somebody get shot 1,000 times by Magneto, and then all of a sudden he's resurrected, we would say, wow, this guy, this is amazing. Wolverine is supernatural. All right. Now let's move on to part 2, Hume's but in fact arguments, dealing with the testimony about miracles. First one, well, basically they say, part 1, all right, even if a miracle happens, it's never rational to believe it because for the various reasons he gave. Part 2, he's like, well, actually, when we start to examine the actual evidence we have for things like Nessie and Batboy and the resurrection of Jesus and UFOs and stuff like that, it's even worse. So we actually have absolutely no reason to believe in this kind of thing. First, miracles lack reliable testimony. There are no credible witnesses. It's a quote of sufficient social standing, etc. Secondly, humans tend to want to believe wild tales. You know what? Life is much cooler if you have a Loch Ness monster and you're in the lake behind your house. I'm just going to admit that. Third, primitive peoples usually produce these claims and they might get just entrenched via structures of society and passed on, so that even smart people believe in something ridiculous like the resurrection of Jesus, that kind of thing. And fourth, miracles happen in other religions, so these count against each other. These counteract each other. Okay? On the discussion board, we can kind of blow off number 4. I want you to talk about the first 3. First, no credible witnesses. Quote, "For first, there is not to be found in all history any miracle attested by a sufficient number of men of such unquestioned good sense, education, and learning as to secure us against all delusion in themselves." So, of such undoubted integrity as to place them beyond all suspicion of any design to deceive others, of such credit and reputation in the eyes of mankind as to have a great deal to lose in cause of their being detected in any falsehood. Okay? So, in other words, no wise person with a lot to lose has been a witness to any of these miracles. Alright? What you have is people like Joe Dirt, members of the crazy Texas Chainsaw Massacre clan, or somebody like Sawyer from the film Lost. Jesus' disciples were uneducated fishermen, so the credibility of these dopes is in question. And I think that, we can rank testimony, right? So, when you look at, think about UFOs, murder trials, etc. Whose testimony do you rank higher than others? And we kind of did this last week with the near-death experiences. Okay? Do you rank maybe people who have a lot to lose by admitting something is true? Maybe people with certain educational backgrounds? Do you rank doctors higher? You rank pilots versus passengers? If they see a UFO? Right? And so yeah, maybe scientists versus children. Alright, so you get the point. And so Hume's saying, look, do we really have people who are testifying to this miracle, or is it the equivalent of a child or some uneducated hillbilly? Alright? Okay. Hope this helps a little bit. Hume's second point. People want to believe the strange and unusual. Secondly, quote, "Secondly, the passion of surprise and wonder arising from miracles being an agreeable emotion gives a sensible tendency towards the belief of those events from which it is derived. The many instances of forged miracles and prophecies and supernatural events, which in all ages have either been detected by contrary evidence, or which detect themselves by their absurdity, prove sufficiently the strong propensity of mankind to the extraordinary and marvelous, and ought reasonably to beget a suspicion against all relations of this kind." Alright? So this is a psychological point that we can kind of all admit to. Alright? Most of us want to believe in aliens and Bat Boy and the like, so we should be highly skeptical of people when they make these miraculous claims. Think about it. Do you agree? And this is something good to give an example from your life. Maybe as a kid or even now, you wanted to believe in it because it's cool. Alright? Bigfoot, there's all these Bigfoot shows on History Channel or Animal Planet or something. I mean, think about the Bigfoot believers. In Ohio, he's called the Grass Man by Indians. But what do you think? Alright? So, psychologically, yeah, we might want this in our lives, so we might believe in Bat Boy. Do you guys know Bat Boy? This was big when I was in high school. But All right, the third argument. Primitive peoples. Thirdly, it forms a strong presumption against all supernatural and miraculous relations that they are observed chiefly to abound among ignorant and barbarous nations. Or if a civilized people has ever given admission to any of them, that people will be found to have received them from ignorant and barbarous ancestors, who transmitted them with that inviolable sanction and authority which always attend received opinions. All right? So, only primitive, ignorant people believe in these things. Han Solo's people who believed in the Force, Jack in the TV show Lost versus guys like versus the men of faith. All right. So, and in the case of Christianity, there's a structure of belief that's passed down these primitive beliefs and miracles believed by primitive peoples. So Hume does think that the perpetuation of belief needs to be explained in this age of science. So what we're doing here in part two, what Hume is doing here, he's doing psychology and sociology. All right. Why do Jews still believe in parting of the Red Sea, Passover, and all this stuff? Well, you could tell a story where these cultural traditions were done, Passover meal, the Seder every spring, and done for thousands of years, and that's why people still believe it. You chant these same things over and over again, you read the same books, and you pray them, and you have a community that encourages such a thing. That's how it happens. Same thing, Christianity. You do communion every week, every month, or every so often, and so you believe in the death of Christ and the resurrection of Christ. And so originally, all these myths in Judaism, all these myths in Christianity were invented by primitive and barbarous peoples, and then they constructed structures so that psychologically, sociologically, these beliefs are passed down, and so even smart people, smart doctors, engineers, pilots, scientists, they're going to believe these prehistoric myths. All right? So, what do you think? Do miracles only show up in cultures that are superstitious and poorly educated? All right? Think about our near-death experiences and so yeah, which stories are you inclined to believe more true? So most people think, ah, you know, well, if a scientist or all right, does this make sense? Now, of course, scientists are people too. They're not infallible. So Hume would say, sure, we might give more credibility to a scientist, but so what? He's just a person too. This is from Apocalypto. This guy ripped his own heart out. And Hamom Shiva, if you've seen Indiana Jones Part 2, you have the guy ripped another heart out. Forgive me, it's kind of gross. So, fourth, testimony of competing religions destroys itself. Quote, every miracle pretended to have been wrought in any of these religions, and all of them abound in miracles, as its direct scope is to be established a particular system to which it is attributed. So it has the same force, though more indirectly, to overthrow every other system. And destroying a rival system, it likewise destroys the credit of those miracles. Okay? So in other words, Judaism uses the miracles of the Exodus from Egypt and the existence of the law. Christianity uses the miracle of the resurrection, as well as Jesus' other minor miracles, raising Lazarus from the dead, feeding of the 5,000, walking on water, so on. Islam uses the miracles of the Quran. Satanists believe Buddhism is false because Satan allows them to walk through fire. Yes, I heard some Satanists talking on the radio. Art Bell's Coast to Coast about this. So, all of these religions founded on the claims of miracles ultimately cancel each other out, is what Hume believes. All right? But I think there's severe problems with this. All right, if miracles happen in every religion, then at least you have some kind of supernaturalism. Maybe God is working in every religion. Or maybe God is a crazy trickster God who wants everybody to believe different religions and is trying to confirm all these different religions. And so it's just crazy. All right. Now, well, we're going to do this in the discussion board, not in class. So you want to evaluate the epistemic strength of David Hume's arguments. All right. If it helps, apply it to the resurrection of Jesus on the discussion board. But we're going to focus on these first three. Okay. All right. Let's look at some critiques of Hume. First, atheist William Rowe, emeritus of Purdue University. A wise man, therefore, proportions his belief to the evidence. Hume does allow that human testimony could overwhelm experience. So, thus suppose, quote, thus suppose all authors in all languages agree that, from the 1st of January 1600, there was a total darkness over the whole earth for 8 days. Suppose that the tradition of this extraordinary event is still strong and lively among the people, that all travelers who return from foreign countries bring us accounts of the same tradition, without the least variation or contradiction. It is evident that our present philosophers, instead of doubting the fact, ought to receive it as certain, and ought to search for the causes whence it might be derived. Okay? So, this is one qualification. Human testimony could, in some cases, overwhelm experience if these certain criteria are met. If everybody believes it, and so on and so forth. Okay? More weaknesses in Hume's argument. Testimony is not the only type of evidence. There's direct and indirect evidence. There's also direct eyewitness account, testimony of someone, and there's indirect account, evidence not from testimony. We mentioned this when we talked about the couple camping with the 4 daughters. Okay? And sometimes indirect evidence is more powerful than direct evidence. So yeah, read Rowe's example of the bear in the camp, page 142. It's what I told you about the parents camping is a variation of that. All right? And let's look at the atheist C.D. Broad and his quote on the next slide. Quote, an example is provided by the story of the resurrection in the Christian religion. The direct testimony for this event appears to me to be very feeble, but the indirect evidence is much stronger. We have testimony to the effect that the disciples were exceedingly depressed at the time of the crucifixion, that they had extremely little faith in the future, and that after a certain time this depression disappeared, and they believed that they had evidence that their master had risen from the dead. Now, none of these alleged facts is the least odd or improbable, and we have therefore little ground for not accepting them on the testimony offered us. But having done this, we are faced with the problem of accounting for the facts which we have accepted. What caused the disciples to believe, contrary to their previous conviction, and in spite of their feeling of depression, that Christ had risen from the dead? Clearly, one explanation is that he actually had arisen, and this explanation accounts for the facts so well that we may at least say that the indirect evidence for the miracle is far and away stronger than the direct evidence. All right. C.D. Broad's sentiment is expressed by people like Gerd Ludemann, who don't believe in the actual resurrection of Jesus, but they think this indirect evidence is so strong that they actually believe that the disciples saw the risen Jesus, or appearances of Jesus. Now, he doesn't have an explanation, as far as I know, of what these appearances are. He doesn't think God exists and God raised Jesus from the dead, but he says, wow, the disciples had something to them, and the evidence is good enough that they saw the risen Jesus, and so he'll eat that. Now, many people offer testimony that, oh, Jesus had a twin brother who appeared to them, or such things like that. So there's sometimes some alternative explanations. But my point is, this indirect evidence leads a lot of these skeptical secular scholars to think that these disciples saw something they thought was Jesus, or had really appearances of Jesus. Does that make sense? All right. Hume's view in science. William Rowe cites C.D. Broad's critique that Hume's view would make scientists recalcitrant to any reports of anomalies in science that could potentially cause a need for a current scientific theory to be revised. So, C.D. Broad is saying if Hume's theory cannot allow for improvements in science to occur, it is problematic. All right? Hume, on Broad's view and other people's view, is a very limited epistemology. If we're going to be so skeptical of things that happen, our science is not going to be able to develop. All right? So, what do you think about Hume's limited epistemology? So, in other words, we cannot know much on Hume's philosophy of knowledge. He limits the area of knowledge significantly. C.D. Broad quote, again, quote, clearly many propositions have been accounted laws of nature because of invariable experience in their favor. Then exceptions have been observed, and finally these propositions have ceased to be regarded as laws of nature. But the first reported exception was to anyone who had not himself observed it in precisely the same position as a story of a miracle, if Hume be right. All right? So, the case of ice. Remember, Hume said that people at the equator should not trust travelers from the north who claim that water can exist in a solid state. It goes against their whole experience that water could turn into something solid. All right? But Hume does allow at a certain point, enough certain testimony or observation, you should believe it, but the people at the equator are not justified in believing in ice. Does that make sense? Even if a traveler's testimony tells them. So what do you think about this? How large of a problem is this for his view if it keeps people from believing truths about reality? This is a tangent. I don't know why I put the slide in here other than ice, but if you need a good book, you have to read this about Shackleton. I think he sailed in 1914, but the book is by Alfred Lansing, Endurance, Shackleton's Incredible Voyage. All right, fantastic. William Rowe's conclusion. Putting together these two objections to Hume's arguments, it is fair to say that he has both left out of his account an important kind of evidence for miracles, indirect evidence, and grossly overestimated the weight that should be given to past experience in support of some principle thought to be law of nature. It remains true, however, that a reasonable person will require quite strong evidence before believing that a law of nature has been violated. It is easy to believe the person who claimed to see water run downhill, but quite difficult to believe that someone saw water run uphill. Okay? We'll beg off on the violations definition of miracles. What I guess one of the major worries is when you study the philosophy of science and what laws of nature are, this word violation might predispose somebody to reject any definition, a miracle claim. All right. So just an unlikely occurrence that is not in conjunction with the laws of nature as we currently know. Okay. You want to allow for God, if God created the universe and designed the laws of physics, if he wants to suspend gravity, electromagnetism, weak strong nuclear force, and not act, he's not violating any laws. God is just choosing to act in a certain way, and unlike he or she acted the 13.7 billion years before in some small area. All right. So, well, email me or post to the discussion board. This is confusing and I'm kind of rushing over it. But violations, that word might have some kind of rhetorical or psychological impact on you, I think is the major worry. All right. William Lane Craig's critiques. We want to focus on Hume's but in fact argument that direct Hume's four but in fact arguments that direct testimony is lousy. The first his fourth argument, pluralism arises from miracles, where Hume said, given all these revelatory traditions and miracles, they cancel each other out. But really, do they? What are the miracle claims of each religion? In Islam, Mormonism, Hinduism, Buddhism. Why not look at each miracle on a case-by-case basis? Maybe some miracles are more justified than others, and so some miracle claims should be accepted and others rejected. All right? And also, this argument still does not get Hume's naturalism. Supernaturalism still reigns if a lot of miracles are happening around the world, all right? So we might just have to accept some kind of pluralism with regards to religions, okay? But let me say a couple things. Just because God does something, it doesn't necessarily mean your religion is true. Okay? I think this is important, because I saw this a lot. Okay? Just because God answers a Mormon's prayer for healing okay? So, maybe God answers the prayers of, let's assume Christianity is true. A loving, good God will listen to any child in any religion on the planet when he or she prays. And if it's possible, God will grant and answer that prayer. Okay? Let's just say that's true. But so just because a Buddhist kid prays and God answers that prayer, does that mean that the Buddha was truly an enlightened being? Or just because a Mormon prays and God answers that prayer, does that mean Joseph Smith was a true prophet? No, not necessarily. It just might mean God has mercy and loves everybody on the planet and is going to answer some of their prayers. Okay? So we need to be sure of what, just because we're right or God does something for one person, that doesn't justify the whole worldview. Okay? Does that make sense? And I see this all the time. And I think we see it. Like in Scientology, just because auditing or the practice of getting clear with a therapist and auditor works, they're using psychotherapy techniques, Freud's ab reaction. Like, just because that works, that does not mean that that Xenu exists and that L. Ron Hubbard was a prophet. Do you know what I mean? Now, maybe L. Ron Hubbard was a prophet and Xenu did exist and trapped all these thetans in our bodies and our souls 70 million years ago. Maybe, but just because something works in your religion doesn't mean the whole worldview and everything in it is true. Does that make sense to you? That's what I'm saying. So that's why Hume, I think, fails here in this argument. All right. Here's from the movie 300 and Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring, the death of Boromir, Aragorn kissing him, King Leonidas. All right. These are primitive peoples and cultures. What about this argument from Hume that there are no credible witnesses? Okay? There's been no person of standing who had nothing to lose that we can trust with the testimony that Jesus rose from the dead. Okay? The 17th century apologists, they responded to Hume. And they said this. They asked these questions. What kind of IQ do you need to tell if someone is dead? What kind of IQ do you need to tell if someone is alive? Do you need a high school education for this? Okay? But let's, for the sake of this argument, assume Jesus was dead, crucified, stabbed with a sword, buried in a tomb, had 100 pounds of spices on him. How intelligent do you have to be to to realize the guy is dead when a Roman soldier stabs a dude with a sword, all right, who's been hanging on a cross for hours, all right? And how intelligent you have to be to realize he's not dead and he's walking around eating fish and joking with you, okay? So, that's what they say. You don't have to be very smart, that type of thing. Now, now, okay. Well, it's a tangent. Their disciples are going to be somewhat, might be credible, even though they're just dumb fishermen, supposedly. Though I think Peter was brilliant. Um, Even though they're just uneducated fishermen, they still have a lot to lose. Because why? They're going to their deaths because um, the Sanhedrin is persecuting them and killing them. And the Roman Empire, you have people who are going after Christians. Okay? It's not good for your reputation to be a Christian after the death of Christ. All right. To Hume's credit, my take, that Hume's skepticism is somewhat justified and we can take his points into consideration. All right? If your neighbor comes over and tells you some crazy story, we don't want to believe some crazy ad hoc theory without any kind of evidence. All right? We don't immediately want to run to believe in aliens or Loch Nessie or whatever if there are a lot of other alternative explanations. Okay? So, appealing to Nessie or to UFOs or to X-Men powers, Wolverine or Magneto, that might be an ad hoc explanation. Make sense? But as good philosophers, we do want to make an inference to the best explanation of the facts. All right? All right, we just had the season finale of The Walking Dead, and I thought it was pretty awesome and interesting. But basically, can you tell the difference between living persons and zombies? Well, the little kids last season, for the one girl, she was a little nuts, so she couldn't tell the difference. But besides that, most people can tell the difference between zombies and living people in the Walking Dead universe. The same in the Shaun of the Dead universe. If you've seen that. Where's Daryl? How come he's in that picture? Look at little Carl. All right. Richard Swinburne, he discusses miracles in his great book, The Existence of God. His book, Is There a God?, is a layman's version of Existence of God. So, there's a little cartoon right there. This, Richard Swinburne gives some interesting take on kind of the necessary background knowledge. Okay? So, Swinburne thinks a lot of work can be done if we look at all these arguments for God's existence. If we look at William Lane Craig's resurrection of the medieval Kalam cosmological argument, if we read Robin Collins' fine-tuning argument from physics, remember the argument that convinced Anthony Flew to believe in God. We look at C.S. Lewis's, William Sorley's moral argument. We look at the argument from consciousness or the argument from mind, aka the Noological Argument by Swinburne and J.P. Moreland, and the Ontological Argument, Descartes, Anselm, Plantinga. Anyway, you look at all these arguments for God's existence, and you might say, wow, there is evidence for God's existence, and in fact, I actually think it's more probable than not. Or you could be even less certain. You might be on the fence. Wow, there's good evidence for God's existence. The problem of evil and naturalism, they knock some of that evidence down, but at least there's good reasons to believe in God exists, and there's some reasons to believe God doesn't exist. But if God exists, maybe this God has shown up in history, and since humans have these existential problems of death, looking for meaning and purpose in life, maybe this God cares about us enough to interact with us and teach us some stuff, okay? Through prophets, or maybe showing up on the earth, incarnated as Krishna or Jesus. All right. So, read page 101 if you have it, and Swinburne's Is There a God? How the Existence of God Explains Miracles and Religious Experience. Assume that you think that some or one of the arguments for God's existence give evidence for a personal God. All right? Kalam, design, etc. Can we also suspect that God will not do too many miracles, as Swinburne believes? What do you make of his argument about cancer and prayer? I gave that earlier. It's kind of the Bruce Almighty argument as well. If God answers everybody's prayer, people will stop going to doctors. All right? God has to be selective in answering people's healing prayers. Okay? Otherwise, people will not practice the God-given discipline of medicine. Swinburne says, this is a quiz question too, that background knowledge is important. If we can show that atheism is true, then we'll be inclined to naturalism, but the historical evidence is also important. And the detailed historical evidence could be substantial, especially when you have somebody like the person of Jesus, who said the things he did. And if C.S. Lewis is right, he's either a lord, lunatic, liar, or as Kreft argues, maybe a guru. All right. So, Swinburne thinks actually miracles could provide some evidence for God. Quote, the existence of detailed historical evidence for the occurrence of violations of natural laws of the kind, which God, if there is a God, would have had reason to bring about, is itself evidence for the existence of God. So, there might be evidence from the resurrection of Jesus that would be additional reasons to believe in God. Okay. Read the whole paragraph on page 109 if you have it. But what do you think about this? If you were God, would this be a decent strategy to give humans justification for belief in a particular source of purported information about God? Now, I have a lot of students, and these classes at church I attend, we often don't put ourselves in God's shoes. I mean, it's hard to do. But you're trying to give information to people who are in cultures who believe crazy things. How would you teach them about the creation of the world? All right? You got to use kind of maybe some of the myths that are circulating in that environment. You can't explain quantum physics to people in 3000 BC. You know what I mean? So how do you get these timeless truths to people and couch it maybe in stories that they would understand? All right? Now, how would you get people to believe that you're behind this person of Jesus? You know what? Why not kill him or have him killed, and why not bring him back to life? By raising Jesus from the dead, this is something that we do not see in humanity, in biology. Okay? So if this happens, we know that there had to be a God behind it. So this would be the validating stamp on the person of what Jesus said in his ministry. Does that make sense? So that's what Swinburne thinks, that, yeah, how do we show people that God's behind Jesus' message? We raise him from the dead. And that's something any dumb person can know. Dead, alive. Oh, God was behind this. Oh, the things that Jesus said are true. Jesus was who he said he was. There you have it. All right. Post a discussion board what you think about this story. The Christian religion. So, for Swinburne, background knowledge is very important. So we have to, if you can, read Craig's On Guard. There's a link up. But who was Jesus and Jesus' self-concept? That's important. I think when I taught world religions last fall, we watched a couple weeks of the Bible, the show by the History Channel. That's important too, because people nowadays have no concept of the Bible, what happened in the Old Testament, and what God is, if it's true, is trying to do, redeem all of humanity. And so, if you don't understand the patriarchs of Genesis and the appearance of the law and Moses and the prophets, then it's going to be hard to understand what Jesus is all about. So I would actually check that out at the library and chip away at that, the Bible by the History Channel, or record it on your DVRs. And instead of reading the Bible, you can get a good overview, but it can't hurt to read the Bible too. All right. First, background knowledge is important. Also, other evidence from philosophy is important. Kalam argument, fine-tuning argument from physics. Secondly, a personal God has reason to help provide humans with more knowledge than they have naturally. So we cannot have independent reasons to know if this purported information from God is true, only weak reasons to guide us. Like God would not make us murder 500 people each to acquire salvation. All right, does that make sense? We have a common ethic, okay? And so, if natural law theory is true, God has revealed in us, given us this supernatural power to discover non-natural moral laws, what's good or evil, and we can make some kind of moral judgments. So if we have two different prophets, one prophet says, hey, you know how to get to heaven? You have to cut the heads off of 500 people and burn to death 25 people at midnight on the summer solstice. That is how you get into heaven. Now, he thinks we can know enough about God and the goodness of God and have these instinctual moral intuitions to know that that is not how a good and loving God who designed this universe with love and beauty would make us get salvation. Okay? And so another prophet, he says, hey, you know what salvation is? By grace through faith. So faith in me and becoming my disciple and wanting forgiveness and accepting the forgiveness that Jesus gives, that's how you receive salvation. Once you repent, you become a disciple and start to follow Jesus, that's where salvation and maybe baptism for some is required. Then that's how you achieve salvation. All right. So we can judge, you know what? Jesus' story of salvation is more likely to be true based on my moral intuitions. This crazy guy Larry over here who says to behead 500 people, that's how you get salvation. That's probably not true. It could be, but probably not given our moral intuitions. So that's what Swinburne's getting at. It would help if we had a miracle to affirm what Jesus said. All right? Also, claims of Christian revelation must be compared to other religions. All right. The religio-historical context. So, Swinburne thinks this context makes all the difference in the world. I love this quote by Wolfhard Pannenberg, a 20th century German theologian. He says it makes all the difference in the world that it wasn't just a random person like Hume's Queen Elizabeth who rose from the dead. It was Jesus Christ who was crucified for blasphemy. The one person who said he was the living water all humans thirst for and the bread of life that all humans hunger for. This man was raised. And for me, I think that is true. Like Hume tries to distill it, talk about the resurrection of Queen Elizabeth. Pannenberg's like, forget that, Hume. It makes a difference as Jesus was raised. This guy who said the things he said in the Gospel of John, that I am the living water all humans thirst for, okay? That you're not alone, okay? I provide you meaning and purpose in life. You can follow me and you can enjoy God's quest to stamp out all evil in the world and bring love at the texture of the kingdom of heaven, which is the good and the true and the beautiful to everything we touch in our families, amongst our coworkers, amongst our neighbors, and in the broader world. So, I think that's cool. No Pannenberg's quote. I think there's a quiz question. All right. C.S. Lewis offers an additional argument for miracles in his critique of Hume. If you look at his book, Miracles, he's a guy who wrote some story about witches and wardrobes and stuff like that. All right. Okay, I don't have anything on there for that. Kant gives a critique. He gives kind of an a priori critique. Kant wanted universal categorical laws, and he presumed about God that God would never show up in a contingent historical event to offer salvation through that and teach us how to live through some contingent historical event. So it's Kant's argument against Christianity is very interesting. All right, we'll skip this postmodern stuff. Norman Geisler, he's a Christian philosopher and apologist. He thinks Kant's worry against miracles is worth dealing with. If you want to pause it and read it, go ahead. I'm moving on. And we're just going to finish right there. There's my buddy I lived with for 6 years. Graduated from the University of Cincinnati, has a PhD, and he follows David Hume. So a lot of what we talked about today, we have this guy right here who's drinking an original Angry Mint, angrymints.com coffee mug in my apartment in Mississippi State last spring. This guy believes Hume and does not believe in the resurrection of Jesus for what the reasons that Hume said. Okay? So, these arguments are out there. Please learn them and have your own view. Are you with my one buddy here who thinks that Hume's arguments work and that I should make a note that it seems Hume is open to the Holy Spirit at the end of part 2, where it's a continual miracle if the Holy Spirit rejuvenates your faith and this miracle happens. It'll always be opposed to reason, but I'll have to look this up. But we've had arguments about this, about whether or not Hume is open to the Holy Spirit doing a continual miracle in the minds of man. And so the faith is actually a gift and a miracle. Okay? Which is actually against the evidence of our experience. But there you have it. All right. Learn these arguments in case you have to deal with a guy like this. Personally, I think Craig and Swinburne do a good job of explaining why Hume is very useful at some points. We shouldn't rush to believe in any crazy theory, but we also see Hume's error of not counting indirect evidence being powerful and the background knowledge, which has everything to do with everything when it comes to miracles. All right, folks. I'll see you later. This is Tougher in Mason, Ohio, 1st April 2015. Go want to see Grandma. Bye.